This is the story of the search for India. In the 15th century, human knowledge was limited to this world. So let's move on to the video. Before that, if you are new to our channel, like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.
In the 15th century, human knowledge about the world in which people lived was still limited. Explorers and traders from various countries had already reached India, China, and parts of Africa. Sailors had also reached the Americas, though the fact that it was a separate continent had not yet become fully evident. The vast continent of Africa remained both a mystery and a problem. No one knew how far south it extended, what its exact shape was, or whether it was connected to India. At that time, the common belief was that the Earth was flat and that it was possible to sail to the edge of the world. Stories were also widespread about gigantic, strange creatures that could swallow entire ships. There was little knowledge about Morocco or the African coasts of the Atlantic Ocean, particularly the region south of where present-day Morocco is located.
However, with the passing of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, many of these old beliefs began to die out. Educated and scholarly individuals became familiar with the works of ancient Greek philosophers, as well as Roman thinkers and scientists. It was during this period that the truth was widely accepted. The Earth is not flat, but round. What had once been achieved in the distant past was now being revived in the 15th century. One of the strongest proponents of this idea was Prince Henry of Portugal, who gained fame as a navigator. He even established a school of navigation in Portugal. At this school, he brought together shipbuilders, mathematicians, cartographers, astronomers, and sailors.
In this school, scientists would develop maps and navigational tools, while shipbuilders designed and constructed new types of ships. These new ships were far more advanced and capable of withstanding harsh sea conditions, and were superior to older vessels. Gradually, thanks to better ships, explorers and adventurers were able to make further progress southward and discovered new lands. For a long time, Cape Bojador, like the Cape of Good Hope, located about 150 miles south of the Canary Islands off the African coast, was considered a major obstacle. No one had dared to cross it. Beyond it, there was no fresh water, no grass, and no safe place to rest. However, eventually, this obstacle was overcome as well, and it was discovered that the southern lands were similar to the northern ones. Many explorers were then able to venture even farther south than ever before, though no expedition had yet managed to reach very far.
The early expeditions were not entirely successful. However, explorers began to return with gold and silver, becoming wealthy in the process. These newly rich men inspired other adventurers to push even farther south. Prince Henry the Navigator had already passed away. After his death, Vasco da Gama emerged as a prominent figure. Vasco da Gama was born in Portugal in 1460. His father was the governor of the province of Alentejo. He was a nobleman, notable both as a soldier and a sailor. When Vasco da Gama entered his 47th year, he etched his name into history by discovering a sea route to India. For this sea voyage, he was provided with 3 ships of modern design. 3 of them weighed 120 tons, and 1 weighed 50 tons. Though these would be considered small by today's standards, they were quite large at the time. Vasco da Gama himself commanded one of the ships, his brother Paulo da Gama commanded the second, and a friend named Nicolau Coelho commanded the third. In addition, there was a smaller supply ship carrying ample food and provisions.
Preparation for this expedition was done after careful planning and attention to detail. The sailors carried a 2-year supply of food, which included biscuits, meat, wine, rice, fish, and cheese. They also carried trade goods to exchange in foreign lands. Once all preparations were complete, the king met with his captains at a formal ceremony. During this event, he handed Vasco da Gama 2 letters, one addressed to the King of Calicut, a coastal region in Malabar, India, and the other to Prester John, a legendary Christian king believed to reside somewhere in Africa. The voyage toward India began on July 8, 1497, from a place called Restelo, near Lisbon, Portugal.
Within 3 weeks, the small fleet of ships reached the Cape Verde Islands, located off the coast of Africa. These islands had been discovered by the Portuguese about 20 years earlier. Vasco da Gama and his crew stayed there until August 3rd. After setting sail again, the fleet undertook a 3-month voyage, at the end of which Vasco da Gama guessed he was close to the Cape of Good Hope. Though this was only an estimate, it turned out to be correct. The first land they spotted was St. Helena Bay, located 50 miles north of the Cape of Good Hope. At that point, the land was unfamiliar to them, but they found a bay suitable for anchoring the ships. After spending countless days at sea, it was necessary to bring the ships to shore for cleaning and to gather fresh water and firewood. Thus, on November 10, 1497, the ships dropped anchor. This voyage was the longest continuous sea journey the ships of that era had ever undertaken. The fleet remained anchored in St. Helena Bay until Nauruz around March 21. During this time, the sailors interacted with the local inhabitants, who were friendly in nature. Vasco da Gama and his fellow adventurers set out again, but this time their destiny had changed. On November 18th, they sighted the Cape of Good Hope, but strong and violent winds caused great distress. Once the weather calmed, they began to feel that they were nearing India. At St. Bras Bay, they paused to rest and broke apart the small supply ship, as it was no longer needed. Its supplies were transferred to the remaining ships. Facing more storms, they eventually reached Diaz Point. By this time, they had been at sea for 6 months. The crew of the 3 ships consisted of more than 150 men, many of whom had fallen ill due to vitamin deficiency, likely scurvy. But Vasco da Gama was determined. He would not rest until he had discovered the sea route to India. Violent winds carried them to the Zambezi River estuary, where the local inhabitants were more civilized and welcoming, and fresh fruits were available. Unknowingly, these fruits provided the much-needed vitamin C, and the crew began to recover from illness. They stayed there for a while to clean and repair the ships. Here, they also encountered people who were more refined. Their better clothing and manners indicated that Arab traders had long been reaching this area.
Vasco da Gama felt relieved and hopeful. He sailed north along the coast and reached Mozambique, where Arabic-speaking Muslims lived. Arab ships in the port were loaded with precious metals, gemstones, and spices. However, this stop brought complications. The Portuguese and Muslims, or Moors as they were known, were traditional enemies. At first, the Portuguese were mistaken for Turks and were welcomed, but the truth soon became clear. Armed Muslims in small boats attempted to block their way. Vasco da Gama ordered his small cannons to open fire. The Muslims fled, and Vasco da Gama quickly gave the order to lift anchor and leave.
The Portuguese fleet now faced rough sea conditions again. Vasco da Gama waited for favorable winds. Meanwhile, the fleet reached Mombasa, which is now part of modern-day Kenya. The king of Mombasa welcomed the Portuguese guests warmly and sent them gifts, including a large quantity of oranges and lemons, and allowed their ships to dock at the harbor. 2 days later, Vasco da Gama's fleet set sail again. The crew's health had now improved significantly. At this point, Vasco da Gama needed an experienced navigator. So he seized a small Muslim ship, questioned its passengers, and learned that there was a port called Malindi further north, where Christian ships from India were already arriving. This was great news for the Portuguese.
The Portuguese fleet anchored outside the town, and the Muslim prisoners were taken to the shore in a longboat. They delivered a message to the local king, stating that the white visitors had come with peaceful intentions and carried a message of goodwill. The king's reply was encouraging. He sent gifts for Vasco da Gama and invited him to come ashore. In response, Vasco da Gama also sent gifts to the king, but remembering the incident in Mombasa, he politely declined to come ashore. Still, the king remained friendly. Though Vasco da Gama initially refused to step onto Malindi's soil, he eventually agreed to meet the king. He was treated as a royal guest for several days. The king even provided him with a navigator to guide him across the ocean to India. On April 24, 1498, the Portuguese fleet set off on the final leg of their journey. It took another month to reach India, where the ships finally anchored off the coast of Calicut. Vasco da Gama's mission had been accomplished. He had discovered the sea route to India.
However, there was no enthusiastic welcome waiting for the Portuguese. The local Arab merchants did not view them favorably. Just like today, competition in trade was fierce back then, too. Although the local Hindu ruler showed friendliness, the Arab merchants warned the Hindus that the Portuguese were not there merely for trade, but intended to conquer India. Despite Vasco da Gama's continued diplomatic efforts, tensions rose, and conflict broke out between the Portuguese and the Hindus. Vasco da Gama himself was kidnapped, and it seemed he might be killed, but was saved by his brother's timely intervention, who had taken several important citizens of Calicut hostage and refused to release them until Vasco was safely returned.
It became clear that the Portuguese could no longer stay in Calicut, so they sailed to another coastal city where they were able to establish peaceful trade relations. In November of that year, the Portuguese ships, now loaded with spices, began their long voyage home. The crew was filled with joy, but their troubles were far from over. Illness broke out again, and the crew began to die one by one. In January 1499, the fleet headed south toward the Cape of Good Hope. Though they avoided stopping at any ports along the way and faced strong winds, the winds were at least in their favor. The Atlantic Ocean was stormy and dangerous. The ships were tossed about, and the crew was exhausted, many suffering from disease and weakness. Sailors began dying like flies. Eventually, the ships reached the Azores, but only a few crew members remained alive to keep the vessels operational. In the end, only a third of the original crew made it back to Portugal safely. It became clear that the Portuguese could no longer stay in Calicut, so they sailed to another coastal city where they were able to establish peaceful trade relations. In November of that year, the Portuguese ships, now loaded with spices, began their long voyage home. The crew was filled with joy, but their troubles were far from over. Illness broke out again, and the crew began to die one by one. In January 1499, the fleet headed south toward the Cape of Good Hope. Though they avoided stopping at any ports along the way and faced strong winds, the winds were at least in their favor. The Atlantic Ocean was stormy and dangerous. The ships were tossed about, and the crew was exhausted, many suffering from disease and weakness. Sailors began dying like flies. Eventually, the ships reached the Azores, but only a few crew members remained alive to keep the vessels operational. In the end, only a third of the original crew made it back to Portugal safely.